is because the people who are listening in, of course, they really want to know about you guys. That's the most important thing, is how are you guys doing? And you guys being really important for our future in science. How do you see these changes? And I don't see any issue with sort of starting around the room, because I think unfortunately we're going to get cut off before we can even get around the room unless we get started. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started. And Charlie, I want you to try to comment on why you're in a pharmacology physiology room and why I'm in a pharmacology physiology room, but how exciting it is to be here with all these different kinds of minds and collaborators.
It's a fair question. So, okay, if you didn't get a chance to watch the little poster presentation, my project focuses on persistent viruses in various species, but I'm focused specifically on a virus that infects red pandas. This is a virus we discovered in our lab, and we found it in a single zoo cohort, and we've been now able to do kind of a cross-sectional study across the US and found it in about half of the red pandas we've tested about. We tested about over 100 red pandas. And so these are persistent viruses that they potentially carry around with them for their lifetime. So arguably this could have been slotted into a microbiology session, but since these are persistent viruses, things that they're carrying around with them for their whole lives, maybe the physiology angle of it is that we have to consider these viruses kind of part of how our bodies or their bodies are working.
Well, and how they change biochemistry and gene expression. So yeah, sure. Christopher, in my opinion, I like that the rooms should be randomized, because some of the biggest breakthrough and Nobel laureates, right? There are probably more physicists who have the biology Nobel Prize than biologists, I would argue, right? Because they're coming from a very different place. So I'm going around the way that you guys are, and Christopher, you're next. What got you through this last year, and can you do research in COVID, like good collaborative research in COVID? Can it happen?
So basically, like maybe 2 weeks into the pandemic, I was living in a studio apartment by myself, and my boss could tell I was going crazy. So he was like, "Hey, if you want to come in, COVID projects work." So I spent like a week coming up, digging literature, all that shit, and or all that, and then we kind of came up with something where like a kinase our lab works on may modify the one of the proteins in the coronavirus. Like, okay, let's try that, and then it turns out like this kind of started working, and then there's all these like things at play, and like a lab I rotated in studied these like liquid droplets, and so I had this experience, and then we mix these things together and they form this droplet, and we're like, oh my god, wow. So I was basically been doing that since like March, and I've been working with collaborators like doing like cryo-EM and things like that. So in terms of the COVID research and the collaboration, it's been kind of wonderful.
Oh, good.
I mean, not that many people are around, but you can send an email and you can get like bumped to the front of the line and things like that.
You guys should know. You guys should know that your ability to be resourceful in this way and to be able to produce in the face of that is one of the hallmarks of a scientist who will be happy for the rest of their lives. Because if it's not COVID, it'll be something not working. And when you're able to find that sort of that joy in that answer that you didn't expect and move on, that plasticity, that's what'll hold your heart in all of research. And Charlie knows this of me, is that if somebody ever comes into my lab and says, "Oh, the experiment didn't work," I say, "What do you mean? If you dropped it on the floor, that's one thing. If it just got an answer that's different, that is incredibly exciting. That's the best answer possible. It means whatever we didn't think of, we have to now think about." So good for you, Christopher.
Yeah,
how about you, Deborah? Did it change your life substantially?
I think maybe it's a bit different because I'm in my last year. So it was kind of nice in that I got some extra time to focus on drafting up my manuscript. But I think since time was more limited in the lab, I think we started to be more critical about our research direction and the research planned experiments. Like, are we getting the most out of the results that we're, getting? And so I think, I kind of really miss like the lab in-person interactions, but I think it's also been a really good learning experience for everybody in our lab.
Good. There's something to be said for being forced into that kind of streamlining and thinking really hard about being efficient. My husband is a researcher, but he's also he's worked in startup businesses. And he says everybody who's in research should do a startup business because they'll learn efficiency in a way that no one in academic research ever learns. And I told him that I didn't join academia to be fiscally responsible, so I'll pass on that. Bianca, why don't you tell us about UCSF, because that's a people-intensive place.
Yeah, so I was similar to Deborah. I was a fifth year when the pandemic hit, or middle of my fifth year. So I was trying to wrap up, and I alluded to this earlier. My clinical trial was placed on hold, obviously, since we couldn't bring people into the clinic. It's still actually on hold because of just capacity and what the clinical trial is studying. So kind of had to get creative like Christopher, went to my PI, and we started a COVID-19 project, which the manuscript just got published last month. So that was a great way to, finish out my dissertation. And so I took on more work since I wasn't going into the lab. And so I actually finished writing my dissertation, interviewed during the pandemic, accepted a job, and graduated last month. And so definitely was a very productive but busy pandemic. And I think what really got me through is just the friends in the community at UCSF, and just having, not being able to see people, but getting on Zoom calls or FaceTimes or wine dates, which was just really helpful, especially when, kind of like Deborah said, seeing people is definitely a core part of graduate school. So
yes.
Yes.
How did you translate thiamine receptors and uptake and things like that to COVID? What did you guys specifically look at?
Yeah, so we actually picked 25 drugs in clinical trials between March 17th, 2020 and April 1st, 2020, so right at the beginning of the pandemic, and screened them in vitro against 11 transporters. One of them was the thiamine transporter as well. And so we screened it in vitro, saw which ones had the ability to cause a clinically relevant interaction in humans. And then we took FDA labels and really just used FDA guidelines to see what would actually make that criteria where we would be worried, and we used case reports to support that. And then I did a lot more on the computational side, where we use electronic health records to validate our findings, to basically use these endogenous biomarkers to see, are they elevated in people taking this inhibitor that we found? So it's related to COVID, and obviously more relevant pre-vaccine rollout, but it also will make a difference for people because these medicines are commonly used, not just in the COVID setting.
Cool. Thank you for that. Anna, how about you?
I was second year studying for my QE when the COVID lockdown just began. So it was 2 weeks. And I'm like, perfect, I'll get 2 weeks to study for my QE, uninterrupted, no nothing. And then I finished my QE, and then it was still going on. So I was like, I would like to come back to lab to continue my research because I work with mouse models, and we had to cross breed our model within an immunocompromised line. So it took over a year to generate the model. And when they were discussing about we need to call that line, I was like, do whatever, but that's gonna set me back by 2 years. So my PI and I, we basically fought to keep that line and call everything else. I was able to still go because they were already injected too. So I would just have to do behavior studies. And I'm like, that is so far at the end of the project to have to restart. But yeah, at the end, it all worked out. I was still able to do the study. And on the later half, I was able to write a manuscript on the findings, which got accepted this month. So at the end, it all ended up working out, which I was super stoked about.
That's awesome. And I will tell you, the time to celebrate your manuscripts, you guys, are when you turn them in, not waiting to hear what people think about what you've done, but when you turn them in, when you've pulled together that story, when it's written, you celebrate with your lab then and there. That's when you celebrate. Don't worry about the outcome. You celebrate that wrap up. That's the time to celebrate, okay? And really important and good for getting accepted and passing and everything like that, but all of those celebrations should happen all the time, or at an early stage when you guys, because this is really, a lot of this is really very, very importantly about you guys faithfully with integrity pursuing your curiosity. And as you know, sometimes the forefront of research, the very best research in the world, the most exciting thing on the horizon isn't seen by people early on. We're slow to take that for that uptake. So if you guys see it, if you see that out there in your future, celebrate, despite the fact that everyone around you is a little bit blinded to that, or might not see it in the way that you do. You guys convey it and celebrate. So Peter, go ahead, because you talked to us a little bit about your project, but not about whether COVID changed its direction.
Yeah, no, it did significantly. I'm in a pretty large lab, and so when the pandemic hit, there were a lot of people who were nearing completion of their degrees and who had experiments that were very time sensitive. And so access to the lab to people who were not involved in those projects was very limited. So I did not go into the lab for months, which was pretty tough. You're just like, I'm not making any progress whatsoever.
Yeah.
But I did find I really enjoy being a scientific communicator. My advisor is actually, she writes articles for an open access journal that I contributed like 3 or 4 pieces to over the course of the pandemic, which was really interesting because you got to describe science and scientific discoveries to people who are in government or making policy. So not necessarily to people who are very familiar with it, but you can kind of translate the science for them, which I found to be really fulfilling. So it was not really beneficial to my progress as a graduate student, but to identify something that I might be interested in the future moving forward.
Hey, communication, if that is progress toward what a graduate student needs. Oral communication and written communication, without it, there is no life in research or in science. So trust me that will be as important as all of the other parts of what you've done. It's a huge deal. It's a huge deal.
Yeah, glad to hear.
I'm going to second and third that. Communicating to the public is part of what builds trust in science and scientists. If the public is not informed, if the public is not able to understand, they don't trust it. That's part of what's caused the vaccine resistance. That's part of what's made scientists, they just talk to themselves. No, talking about your science every time you have an opportunity, and particularly to intelligent but not scientific audiences. So huge kudos to bringing that in and maybe even exploring it further. Good work, Peter.
Thank you. Yeah, I found it super fulfilling. So I'm only just starting to get back into the lab, really getting my research moving again. But yeah, I was able to make the most of it.
Were you guys doing the around the clock? Like, were you offered, was your first offer the 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. slot?
No.
No?
No.
I would have done that right away. I'm gonna have to talk to Pamela Line.
Need my beauty rest. Sorry.
She said that should have been an around the clock situation there. That's what we did in my lab. And my advisor, I was at a graduate school at Harvard. My advisor decided that if my ice bucket, I was a molecular biologist, and he told me that if my ice bucket melted, that was a vacation. That was his measure of a break. just to tell you how absurd that was. And he was the best advisor on the planet. Like, this guy, talk about communication. He was an amazing guy, but boy, science, it was 100% what a privilege it was to do it. And so he's down in, he does stem cell research down at UCSD. He's the head of the Stem Cell Institute down there.
Wow.
An amazing thinker.
Very cool. It clearly inspired you, and you are pretty contagious yourself. So Thank
Only
you.
if I'm talking about viruses. I get real scared when I start talking about pharmacology and
One of the other questions that came up, and I'd like to hear from both men and women, was how are women scientists accepted in your labs? Did you feel included? Did you feel heard? Could you comment a little bit about that experience? Anna?
Yeah, I'll start. I have a female PI actually, and for the first 3 years, I joined the lab as a junior specialist, and I stayed with her for 2 years before joining grad school. So for the first 3 years, we were an all women lab. So every single publication, we were just like all women pub, like shout out. It was like amazing. We have like one research assistant now, this is male, but it really fostered this like different sense of empower, like development within me that like I never considered, because my PI would always talk about like, you know, how it was like before for her, and then like different experience, because we're all from different backgrounds, and we would like talk about during lab meetings not only like the science but also like how we got there and what all we had to go through to get there. So to have that small community where we can like talk, share, and empower and support each other was like super amazing, and it still is amazing.
Yeah.
Bianca,
Go ahead.
go ahead. No, same question. How many people have female PIs?
Oh, wow. That is so incredible. Yes.
Okay, I'm just going to say I raised my hand because I'm a PI now, but I did not have a female PI. And not only that, there was no female in my department, my biology department at Harvard when I went through grad school. So yay, 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 yay.
It's wonderful. So what about the guys? Have you got females in your lab, in your team? Do you think, how does it work?
So my lab at one point was just 1 female and 4 guys,
Okay.
which actually my boss recognized was like, you know, this is not really okay. So he hired, he was hiring a technician, and he basically kind of, you know, tried to look for female applicants and everything. And it definitely changed the dynamic, whereas like it was not necessarily like bro time, but like, you know, it was kind of a little less, I don't know. I don't even know how to put it, but it definitely changed the dynamic when we got another woman around. And actually, one of the grad students in the lab, who's the girl, or the person who is throughout the whole time, the female, she had a baby in January of last year, of 2019 or 2020. And so it was really obviously difficult for her. So she missed like 3 months, and then she missed like another 3 months. And then like, you know, the summer's wearing on and she's still not in. So we basically like at one point, like, said like, here, have the calendar, you know, obviously your time is like much more defined, whereas ours is pretty flexible. So, you know, she had priority to the calendar, but I, you know, does that really change the dynamic? I don't know.
Good for you guys for recognizing that.
I mean, yeah. I couldn't imagine what she's going through, honestly.
You can't actually.
Yeah.
Carol Burnett did it the best. Somebody said, what's it like having a baby? A man asked that from the audience. And she said, sir, I want you to take your lower lip. And he did this. And she said, now pull it up over your head. And I thought that was a good visual of empathy. So it was good for you to recognize. I love that you recognize that. But I do think that that leadership, those women recognizing, you know, the empowerment part and is important. But even more diverse a room, women, men, all sorts, to have diversity of all sorts clearly makes a room smarter. Clearly makes a room smarter. All of the literature says that every creative thinking group is better off with diversity at every level, you know, from age to sex to race to anything. Every group is better off. So that is good. Joe, we don't know your history and whether or not you had a female PI.
Yes, no. So my background is in medicine. I graduated many years ago. And at that point, there were 3 women on the faculty that I was exposed to, and I didn't want to be like any of them. And there were 100 medical students, and 93 were men. So I learned to sort of encourage myself. There was certainly a lot of you don't belong here, but those who know me well know that I'm stubborn, so it didn't make any difference to me. But I went on to be an academic for about 3 years, and then a real doc for 12 years. And then I had this epiphany that I really wasn't learning or learning new stuff. And so I went back into research and did drug development for my last 20 years of life. And I loved it. That was really fun.
So was that in a company or at an academic institution?
It was neither. It was, I became queen of startups. So your comment about startups and efficiency, I know this well.
Yeah.
But it was wonderful. I had virtual teams. They were all over the nation, sometimes all over the world. And
so you had to do the looking for capital investment, producing a product in real time.
Yes. And learning how venture capitalists think, that's scary.
Yeah. You guys, there's a part of that efficiency that my partner taught me is that from startups, in particular startups that are around software development and stuff, they have a model for running a lab that I think I'd like to send to all of you. It's really interesting. Instead of the traditional sort of lab meeting that you might have once a month or every week, once a week, in addition, in a lab, especially like a big lab, say Peter, like what you're in, there's something called a scrum, where every single day, literally standing with your coffee in your hand, not sitting, you all get together, and in seconds, you just identify what you're going to do that day, and if there's something that's stopping you from doing it. That's it. And so, for example, Peter, if you came to that scrum and you said, I did this, this immunofluorescence yesterday, and I got this background, and I'm going to try to troubleshoot it. And if you came back a week later and said, I'm still getting this background, that would be a heads up to the people in the room that was a stopping point for you and that they needed to confront that. And so that scrum is an everyday thing. Charlie and I do it because he's literally through this wall. So we just yell at each other, but also with other members of the lab. It's an open door kind of thing. And my lab is smaller than, for example, yours, Peter. How many people does Pam have in her lab right now?
Got like 25.
Yeah, that's a big lab.
Yeah.
That's a huge lab.
Yeah.
How big's your group? Christopher, you said 6, 7, 5? How about you, Deborah?
Maybe 5 or 6.
Yeah, I think it would work with whatever size, to be honest, but it's remarkable because what startups need is to never get bogged down and the really important thing is to never get your attention straying into a problem that has nothing to do with your hypothesis. Yeah. So if you have a product that you need to put out, anything, no matter how curious you are about it, anything that goes in a right hand or left hand direction in academia, we just turn. We're just like, oh, that's cool. Shiny object, shiny object, Oh, look, shiny object. That's what we do. That's what I do. But you can't do that in development in a startup. And Joe, you can comment, but you can't do it. And so you're so driven with that, that hypothesis that you end up being a much more efficient scientist, I think.
Yeah, and you know what's wonderful about startups is how much you learn. So I literally learned more pharmacology in my startups than I did when I was in medical school. So I learned toxicology from a toxicologist. In fact, the toxicologist taught me how to design clinical trials.
Huh. There you go, Bianca.
So they said, look, you can answer one big question and maybe 2 or 3 side questions. If you have more than 4 questions, you need another experiment. And they were right, because like the shiny objects, all my investigators, well, let's measure this. And I'm going, what does that have to do with this? We didn't allow them to look at every shiny object unless they wanted to fund it. They wanted to fund it, of course they could do it.
Charlie, I'm looking at you.
this has been a constant issue for me because I do, and Patty is guilty of the same thing. So
I so am.
So it's been a challenge for her to try to keep me focused on my on where I should be going when there are
It's the most learning I've ever done, you guys, because as a pathologist, and Peter, you'll know this, when you look histologically at something, right? When you look at inflammation or whatever, so many questions about every single individual animal, and you kind of want to go down all of those paths. And it's also in part where I feel comfortable, like I'm reading tissues, that's what I do. I'm an anatomic pathologist. So keeping my mind focused on a sequencing experiment that's not working, challenge. So Charlie has taught me how to do that because I have to be good for him.
He has to do that for me because I'm a pathologist as well, and so I focus on those pieces. But now, approaching my 3rd year on the project, I'm finally getting to start doing some of the get back into the pathology pieces that I've been asked to put off for this long. So
it's worth it to focus your project, to really make significant progress forward, to really understand if it's going to substantially contribute. And the way that my advisor put that, he said he would finish every single contribution to a conversation was, so what? I'd be like, oh, I saw this and I saw that. And he would say, so what? And he didn't mean that in a way that it wasn't important. He meant that, how does that relate to where we're going? Tell me specifically how that relates to where we're going. How does that edify what you're going to do tomorrow? And that was fair. That was entirely, utterly fair, to learn how to focus that way. Cool stuff.
And I will also still put in a vote for serendipity. I will still vote for your curiosity driving you. Honestly, one of the reasons Einstein only talked to young people, and one of the reasons the Caltech scientists told us to go support young scientists, is because you have these really completely weird ideas that turn out to be interesting.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So curiosity, collaboration, and commitment. Oh my gosh. All of us know how hard it is to be a grad student. This year, I don't know that I would have kept it together. So you should credit yourselves with coming through some really tough stuff. And by the way, we're not done. But it's, I want to refer you to something that 3M did. You know, the guys who made yellow stickies?
Absolutely, Minnesota.
And they live in Minneapolis. And they have something called the State of Science Index. And if you Google SOSI or 3M and look on it's a global survey of what people think of science and scientists. And 4 years ago, people went, science isn't important. Scientists just talk to each other. Well, since the pandemic, those needles have shifted. Oh, I think science is important. I think, we need to listen to those scientists. So big shift in public opinion. And part of it was about communication, Peter. We aren't good communicators, or we didn't train when I was doing it. We didn't train to be communicators. So that's a really, maybe a 4th C. I would add communicate.
Absolutely. I think that's a good note to end on, you guys. We're gonna wrap it up if you can. That's a fantastic, powerful way to end. It's fantastic to meet all of you, and I invite this whole group out to the farm for a glass of wine and a walk around with the puppies anytime.
All right, listen, thank you, Pat, and thank you each scholar. We are sincere. We hold you in high esteem, and we love being on your team.
It's a privilege. It's a huge privilege to see all of you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Thank you very much.